we know that any of us who've done anything to do with economics in our career will understand the need for there to be a supply and demand equilibrium so that you get even level pricing and that kind of thing. But as I've already mentioned, these large investment funds are buying and trading in prime property, but actually secondary property is in a real mess. So let's just have a look at what I've described as the market conundrum. A friend of mine, Joe Pitt, said to me last year that he thought that this is a description of where we are in the market today. Everybody wants to sell what nobody wants to buy. And by that he means, if you own a development site with no income coming in it, and all it's doing is costing you money to insure it or to look after it or to look after the buildings or pay empty rates, that's what you would want to sell at the moment. And unsurprisingly, nobody wants to buy it. The conundrum, of course, is that everybody wants to buy what nobody wants to sell. If you've got a fantastically let property in a fantastic location with the tenant paying the rent on a quarterly basis, that is what people want to buy, what people want to invest in. But why on earth would you want to sell it? Because if you sell it, what are you going to do with the capital? Because there isn't any more of that stuff to buy. So you can see that when you look at both sides of that equation, it's very hard for the market to move forward, particularly when the banks are being very, very restrictive about the amount of money they're prepared to lend. And that is, of course, in complete contrast to how we got here, where the banks couldn't lend money fast enough in 2005, 2006, 2007. They couldn't shovel the money out of the door quickly enough. And what they were trying to get was market share to drive up their share price, to drive up the capital value of the bank as a business. And, of course, that proved to be completely disastrous because one of the things they did was to crank up these loan-to-value ratios. Historically, they've been at about 2/3. So the bank would only lend 2/3 of an independent valuation of that individual property. Over the course of 2005 onwards, they started to lend 70, then 80, then 90, and in some cases, 100% of the value of the loan. Now, when you think that the gap between the value of the property and the value of the loan is designed to protect the bank against market fluctuations, you can see that lending 80, 90, or 100% of the loan actually is a very risky business. I have one case at the moment, in fact it's the case that Chris was talking about in New York, where an English bank lent to an English company to buy in New York properties valued at £300 million. And they lent him 107% of £300 million. Now you too can do the maths. That means he was given by the bank £21 million more than the value of the properties he was just buying. How does that make good business? Really, really poor business, and it's not surprising that that company went into administration. But if you look at this particular slide, what you can see on the blue bars moving upwards is the amount of lending. Rapidly cranking up, as I was saying, across 04, 06, 07. And even 08 and 09, simply because companies were not paying the interest. The interest was being rolled up into the loans, and therefore the amount out there as a loan was increasing dramatically. The purple line, however, is the amount of property in commercial property terms in the UK, expressed as an index. However, what you get is this area here. All the time, the difference between the loan and the value of the property is significantly back. The banks are managing their risk against market fluctuations. And it takes not the need to be a rocket scientist to see that at this point they're in equilibrium and at this point they're in disaster. Because it's enormously impossible to imagine how property values can increase significantly to recover that position and give the banks a margin for safety over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. It simply isn't going to happen. And if you think about how long it takes property to double in value, you'll begin to get an idea of why I believe that. So a few more things that helped to cause the problem. The banks were so keen to lend the money that they started to take out all of these covenants, these tests, and it became known as Covenant Light, just like Miller Lite or Bud Light. Took out all the really important ingredients. You can see that they stopped doing due diligence. You know, I can tell you, if you'd done due diligence on this bloke who borrowed the money for the US, you wouldn't have lent him 7 million, let alone 107%. You know, really, it should never have happened. And those of you who have borrowed money from banks to help your businesses will know that they've probably asked, or insisted even, that you put in place some kind of interest rate hedge or some kind of facility that apparently protects you from interest rate rises. What, of course, it didn't do was to protect the banks against interest rate falls. And I have a case at the moment where the property was originally purchased for 1.1 billion. I realise, you know, it's a huge building, but 1.1 billion. Value today about 800 million. And it really doesn't matter whether you think of that as billions or millions. You know, that drop is quite dramatic. And the bank insisted that the company put in place a hedge and a swap to protect the bank and the company from rising interest rates. What they forgot was that interest rates could go down dramatically from something north of 5% to 0.5%. And to unwind that hedge, which is a 30-year hedge, is going to cost £230 million. That means that the debt is actually not 1.1 billion, but 1.33 billion, because you have to add on the 230 million. And you have to set that now against a property which is only worth 800. And these are really, really big problems, not least in my perception, caused by people thinking after they'd sent an email. Now, some of you are of my generation, and you'll remember that we used to work in an office and people used to write letters to us. That doesn't really happen anymore, but in those days, in 1969, when I started work, you got a letter which had taken a couple of days to reach you, and you had a couple of days to think about it before you wrote out a reply longhand, and then somebody typed it up using carbon paper and all that kind of stuff. You remember? So you had about a week between receiving the letter and answering it. Then the fax machine came along, and everybody started to think that you needed to reply to that the following day. And now, of course, we have not only email, but instant messaging. And I find now that if I haven't replied to something within about 10 minutes, the person who sent it to me thinks I'm dead. You know, it's a real problem. And the same thing happened not just on the bank side, but on the borrower side too. People were firing off and trying to get excited, pushing on and borrowing money and buying property, but not really thinking about it. They believed that they were good at being a property owner. And let me tell you, you have to be an absolute idiot not to be able to make money from property when the market is going up at nearly 20% per annum. Just for a couple of, 1 year particularly, it was in the 15 to 20% growth. When you've got that kind of growth, you've got to get it really, really wrong to lose money. But management was inexperienced. They certainly didn't understand the more complex instruments like CMBS, which is commercial mortgage-backed securities, which I haven't got time to talk about, but is a science in itself. Fully understood by the American markets, but not understood by the UK markets. We tried to call them securitizations because it sounded simpler than CMBS. Now, most of you here today, I suspect, don't really get involved in securitizations. But let me just say that at Lehman Brothers, they securitized their securitizations by buying in the debt that they couldn't sell and agglomerating it together and putting it back out into the market as another securitization. Now, Moody's and Dun & Bradstreet, the rating agencies, tried to assess for the benefit of the lenders what the risk was on these securitizations. They didn't really get it right for the first securitization, so they had no real chance of getting it right for the second securitized securitization. And I have to tell you, in Lehman's case, there were some securitized securitizations. So it's a very, very complex market. And how these CMBS